Also, they're far from home. So once they put those goods on that ship goes to Africa, and those goods are tailor-made, even for the destination on the African coast that that ship is destined for. Okay? If you don't sell it there, value has plummeted. Okay? So they're far away from home, risky market, looking backward in time. Just put the stuff on, ship it to Africa, do the best you can. And you look at the structure of the Royal African Company and their remuneration and payment systems, it all suggests that that's what's going on. Okay? So the risky nature of it is, of course, then the merchants would petition the crown for monopoly to keep the rest out. And that's what we tend to see. We tend to see a whole bunch of that kind of stuff. Okay? Now, for Africans, it's less risky. African slave traders capture some slaves, take them to the coast, want to sell them. If the price is low, don't have to. You can use them home. In fact, I think that's part of the dynamic that drives the expansion of slavery in Africa itself, what Paul Lovejoy calls the transformation of slavery. And I think there's probably a gender component to that. And I'm trying to figure out a way to look at this data and use the gender ratio of exports to get at some of this issue of the expansion of slavery in Africa itself. When the price is low, I would expect the proportion of women to decline, because those are the ones that are relatively more valuable in Africa itself. And that's where the expansion of slavery in Africa itself begins to take hold. Polygyny as well. Later on I'll show you how the slave trade is correlated causally with the expansion of polygyny. And enslaved women, big part of that. And then there's an ex-post investment decision. They're there, they see the price. The circuit is not as long. Information is flowing both ways. You see, in the transatlantic, in the triangular trade, it's just flowing in one way. Between the interior and the exterior, as you're going to the coast, people are coming back. You're going to be getting information. So there's much better information flow in Africa. And this control of kings, there's a lot of evidence of that. I think I can sort some of that out. It's not just kings haphazardly controlling here and not controlling there. I think there's a time dimension to it and a location dimension to it. Okay? So I'll say some more about that later on. So here are my data sources. Here's the stylized depiction of the triangular trade. Textiles, rum, manufactured goods to Africa from Europe, and I add their guns and gunpowder, because that's a big important part of my story. And then the slaves are shipped to the Americas, and while they're sugar, tobacco, and cotton and all is shipped to Europe. Now my data sources here, one, the transatlantic slave trade database, now up to 35,000 transatlantic slave trade voyages, about 13.5 million people. Marion Johnson went in and digitized the Anglo-African trade statistics. These are the statistics collected in the British Customs House, 1699 to 1807 are the ones I use. Because the Brits are out of the slave game after 1807. Okay, they abolished the slave trade in 1807. This measures all of the goods that left England for Africa, and all of the goods that came back to England from Africa. Okay? Now, what I do is subtract the flow back from the flow to Africa. There's a huge amount left over. And that's the amount that's used to purchase slaves. Because those slaves did not go back to England. Those slaves went to the Americas. Okay? So ship a bunch of goods here. Some of it's exchanged for ivory, pepper. That goes back to Africa. Subtract that out. Whatever's left over is being exchanged for slaves on the coast of Africa to be taken to the world. Okay? That's what I call the investment, the working capital, the commodity capital invested in the slave trade. And then these are some sources on sugar. Okay, I don't use them that much anymore, but at one time I thought they were pretty important. Okay, so here's the fundamental impact of that slave trade on Africa. The issue here is whether or not the supply, the quantity of slaves showing up on the coast of Africa is exogenous to the slave trade. Whether or not it existed before the slave trade is the way some people put it. Okay? And if that's the case, then as the demand for slaves increases, then the only thing that will change here is an increase in the price. The quantity won't change. Okay? Now, if African economies are responding to the slave trade, if the slave trade has an impact on the allocation of resources in African economies, then the supply function will look like this. Right? As demand goes up, more resources will be put into the slave trade, right? And more slaves will show up on the coast of Africa. So all we do is look at the relationship between increases in the components of demand. The main one is the commodities sent from England to Africa to be exchanged for slaves, and the number of slaves that gets. Right? If an increase in investment increases the number showing up on the coast, then the supply function must look like this, and the slave trade is forcing a reallocation of resources in Africa, our first step. Okay? If we find no relationship between an increase in investment and increase in slaves, then the supply function looks like this. And really what's happening here is that Africans are fighting wars. There's some captives there. The wars have been fought, the captives are there. What do? Well, we send them to the coast, and the price that reigns is whatever the demand level is, but it won't affect the number of captives taken to the coast. Okay? So here's our results. This should be changes in slaves. This is changes in investment. This is the commodities sent in. What we estimate here is an elasticity of 0.43. Okay? You double the amount of investment sent to Africa, you will increase the percentage of slaves showing up on the coast by 43%. Pretty large effect. Okay? We think that's a pretty large effect. You'll also see that we get guns here. We get a relationship between, this is gunpowder. It's not guns. You can't get measures on guns. But this is gunpowder. Doubling of gunpowder doubles the, doubling of gunpowder increases the number of slaves showing up on the coast by 12 to 13%. Now, we don't know if that's a supply or demand issue because the gunpowder is traded for slaves, and there could be a premium for gunpowder on the coast of Africa, or it could be that it's a technology that allows slavers an advantage in capturing slaves. And we have to spend some real time sort of sorting those two out, and we'll do that later. But the first one is that supply curve is positively sloped. And that's what Patrick Manning meant when he said Africa engaged. It wasn't external or internal. It wasn't international or Africa. It's a combination of the two. Okay? Now, what we then do is model, the first step is to model the effect of this on African institutions. And the first fundamental effect is that there'll be less war, meaning state building, acquiring land, developing a citizenry, and taxing them, and more raiding, going out just for people, and being less interested in land. So here we characterize, and this is a game theoretic model, this is just sort of my summary of that model. We order villages along here, and the returns from the two activities, one being war, citizenry, taxing, the other one being raiding, just going out and capturing people. This is the marginal net return from building an empire. You go out, you conquer some villages, you bring them in, You socialize them, you put them to work, you set up a taxing system, and the revenue flows to the elite. Okay? This is the return from rating. And we argue, and it's pretty easy to defend the proposition that the marginal net returns do not decline as fast here. Hit and run, go out. Don't have to protect the borders like in the state. You just raid. Get some guns, get some gunpowder, go raid. Or organize an army, go out there and have a war, capture the vanquished, but don't conquer the land. That was a practice called eating the countryside that we see practiced more and more in the 18th century. Okay, so here at P1, P1's the price of slaves. At P1, the net revenue from raiding is this. You build an empire until the marginal net return declines below the marginal net return of raiding. So you conquer N1 villages, okay? And then after that, start raiding for slaves. Price of slaves goes up, net revenue from slave raiding increases. The elite now have an incentive to only conquer N2 villages, less than N1, okay? And they start raiding for slaves after that, okay? Direct implication is that there be more independent villages outside of states after the slave trade comes in. We interpret that as implying that there may be more ethnic diversity, that the slave trade stopped the homogenization of ethnic difference. And in fact, we argue, we don't yet have conclusive evidence, that the slave trade also increased the incentive to distinguish insider from outsider, because insiders were less susceptible to be enslaved, outsiders were. Okay? It also reduces the degree of inequality amongst villages and states in any particular region. Okay? Because the state's smaller and there are more villages out there. Okay? So here's our empirical test of these hypotheses. What we do is here we take the Murdoch map of ethnic boundaries. And we got a lot of this from the colonial region, so the colonial books. So a lot of the colonial effect is in this, but we're still getting the slave trade going through the colonial period, okay? And in fact, we've used later maps from 2002, and we get the same positive effect. So while the colonial experience is there, and that's the traditional literature, that it is the colonial power that creates many of the ethnic differences that we see in Africa today. We're saying, yeah, that may be the case, but they were more inclined to create them where the slave trade was more powerful in the past. Okay? So here's a map of the boundaries of various ethnic groups, and if you're familiar with it, you can see that some's right, some's wrong. We're not worried about the boundaries being exact. We're worried about whether or not there's a systematic bias between boundaries being smaller, and the slave trade. Because that's our hypothesis. We're saying that the slave trade reduced the size of these groupings. Okay? And that's the bias we're concerned about. We deal with that in the analysis by using more than one map, and we find the same results. Okay? Now, these red stars here are the ports found in the transatlantic slave trade database. Put some students on it, they found the ports, most of them. We put them on this GIS map. And we know the numbers coming out of these ports. Okay? So then what we do is we break the coast up into 200 of these circles, of these points here, spots. And then we draw circles around them. And we ask the question, is there a relationship between the number of slaves coming out of these ports and the ethnic diversity in the inland behind them? Okay? And this is what we find. I just want to go through this real fast. This is a variety of different ways of calculating those circles on a variety of different maps. This is the people's map. This is the Murdoch map. This is the radius of the circles. This is a different way of measuring the relationship between the slave exports and ethnic diversity. And all of these are positive, and almost all of them are statistically significant. Okay? So clearly a positive relationship between slaves coming out and ethnic diversity in Africa. Endogenizes a lot of the notions of ethnic diversity floating around in the development literature. Okay? Much of it's the result of this history of slavery. Now here we look at some other institutions in this Murdoch database. It's not just geographic expanse, which is what we did in the previous step, but sizes of communities, local hierarchy, whether or not you live in, I don't know, a historic district where you have all kinds of hierarchy, versus a subdivision in the suburbs where, you know, probably no hierarchy other than your remote control that opens your garage door. Right? And then this is political hierarchy above the local level. Whether or not you have elders, local chiefs, divisional chiefs, paramount chiefs, king. Okay? And you'll see here that first, the slave trade reduces the level of political hierarchy. The development literature refers to this as political concentration, and they found that those areas today that have greater political concentration, like this, are those areas that are better able to get roads built, those kinds of public goods that encourage economic development. Okay. And here we have that it reduces the sizes of communities. And we don't know exactly how to interpret that, but you know, it's there. Now here's selection of local headship. How do you select your leaders?
Isn't it the same thing as reducing the size of your land? If you don't want to control more land, you don't want to control more. Isn't it the same?
The size thing could be. Yeah.
If you're a chief.
Yeah, but these are communities. These are like, you know, this is not the chief's community. This is like neighborhood.
Okay.
It's like neighborhood.
So it's much smaller unit.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what Murdoch's picking up there, to tell you the truth. Here's selection of local headship. Okay, whatever that local headship is. Could be elders, could be chiefs, could be whatever. Okay, and here we get a negative effect of wealth. You know, it's not America. It's not that wealth is going to get you elected. Oh, that doesn't happen here. Here's America. It's not that election is going to get you to headship. Okay, because it's negative. What gets you to headship here, what the slave trade is encouraging as the selection process, is heredity. Whether or not you have a right to that office. So less democracy, more what we're beginning to call patrimonial, because that's the word that the development literature is often using to describe African political structures. And here, these are two more. This is a measure of centralization that's been used in the literature that's explaining road building and other infrastructure, stuff like that. We're getting negative there, so there's less building of roads and things like that. And here's the heterogeneity thing. Increases homogeneity of political groupings within a region. Makes them look more and more similar, no dominant player.